Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the book Answering Islam by Norman Geisler and Abdul Saleeb from my atheist perspective. In this video, I'm going to cover chapters 11 and 12 of the book. So let's get started right away with chapter 11, which is titled A Defense of the Deity of Christ. And by the way, we're almost done this book, you all. Can you believe that? One more episode in this series and we're done. So, anyway, chapter 11, A Defense of the Deity of Christ. The Muslim and Christian beliefs regarding Jesus are irreconcilable, Geisler and Saleeb write. Muslims believe that Jesus was human and a prophet, but one who was superseded by Muhammad. Christians believe that Jesus was the incarnation of God and that Jesus was the earthly form of the Son of God, 1/3 of the Trinity. So Christians have a slightly higher opinion of Jesus than Muslims do, which you would guess from the name. To defend the deity of Christ, Geisler and Saleeb first address what they call some common Muslim misunderstandings. And the operative word there is first, because this is the first of many times in this chapter and the other chapter we're going to cover in this video where they chalk up these irreconcilable differences to misunderstandings on the part of Muslims. So, for starters, Christians believe that God is one being composed of three persons. Christians believe, at least most Christians, Trinitarian Christians, believe in a triune God. One of these persons of the Trinity is Christ, the Son, who has existed just as long as the other two persons in the Trinity, which would be the Father and the Holy Spirit, and is of the same nature and the same stature, equal in nature and glory. Geisler and Saleeb say repeatedly throughout this part of the book. The three persons of the Trinity are co-equal. They are all equally God and equally important and equally glorious. Well, this is a bit of a rabbit trail, I know, and it's early in the video, but this discussion of the Trinity reminded me of something that I've always wondered about the Trinity. I've always found it puzzling that if God the Father and God the Son are both part of the same being, and if they have both existed for the same amount of time, forever, and God the Son is not the offspring of God the Father, which is a point that Geisler and Saleeb make later in the material we're going to cover in this video, then in what sense is God the Son the Son? A son is a child, an offspring, a descendant. But if God the Son is none of those things, why call him the Son? I know there are metaphorical applications for the term son. You can say that such and such is a son or a daughter of something, and it means they were inspired by it, or they were influenced by it, or they were a follower of it, or something like that. But I don't think any of those terms apply to Christ and God the Father either. They're completely equal. They're just two persons of the same being, according to the doctrine of the Trinity. So why is one called the Son and one called the Father? Calling one person God the Father and the other God the Son implies a relationship that, according to typical Christian belief about the Trinity, isn't there. And it also implies a hierarchy of authority. The Father being considered, both traditionally in many cultures and within most Christian thought, to be the head of the family that doesn't exist. If God the Father and God the Son aren't actually parent and child, and if they are equal in terms of authority, why is one called the Father and the other called the Son? Why is the Father declared the leader of the human family, according to most Christian thought, when God the Father isn't the leader of the Trinity? Why is God the Father instead of the Son? Or does it matter, since they're the same anyway? And if they're the same, why does God consist of three persons? Why not just one person? Why am I holding up two fingers? Does being made up of three persons while being a single being mean that God suffers from dissociative identity disorder? And what the hell does the Holy Spirit do anyway? If Christians wanted to have a Trinitarian God, why not go with the Father, the Mother, and the Son? Well, actually, I know the answer to that one. The men who thought most of this shit up would rather invent some vague bullshit like the Holy Spirit than make a woman a co-equal member of the Trinity. Anyway, we haven't even gotten to the chapter on the Trinity yet, which we will cover in this video, so digression over. In order to defend the Christian belief in the deity of Christ. Geisler and Saleeb will defend the death and the resurrection of Christ, because Christians believe this to be central to the proof for the deity of Christ. Quote, "Contrary to Islamic thought, there is overwhelming historical and factual evidence that Jesus died on the cross and rose again on the third day. The evidence for Christ's death is greater than that of almost any event in the ancient world." Oh, look, you guys. Remember this argument? Long-time and Atheist Reads watchers, it seems like only yesterday when I first saw it, when I was critiquing the case for Christ, and now here it is again. Oh man, how many years has it been? Time flies, doesn't it? Of all the oft-repeated claims of Christian apologists, this business about the death and resurrection of Jesus being the most firmly established event in the ancient world is the most representative, I think, of the entire apologetics enterprise. It is simultaneously impressive and infuriating in its audacity. To claim that there is any evidence firmly establishing that Jesus even existed is a stretch. To insist that there's more evidence for the death and resurrection of Jesus than any or almost any, they give themselves a bit of wiggle room there, almost any other event in ancient history is just fucking bonkers. And yet apologists make this claim with a straight face, expecting to be taken seriously all the time. And quite a few Christians do take them seriously. So why do they expect to be taken seriously when they say something as outrageous as this? Well, Geisler and Saleeb go through 13 examples of what they claim is evidence for the death of Jesus. And very, very quickly, those 13 examples of evidence for the death of Jesus are Old Testament prophecies for the death of Jesus, Jesus saying that he would die repeatedly in the Gospels, Old and New Testament predictions of the resurrection, the severity of Jesus' injuries sustained on the cross, the fact that crucifixion is a guaranteed death, the piercing of Jesus' side with a spear, Jesus saying he was dying while on the cross. By the way, we're halfway through the evidence, and so far, except for the bit about crucifixion being a guaranteed death, it's all stuff that's written in the Bible. Continuing, the Roman soldiers pronouncing Jesus dead, Pilate making sure Jesus was dead before turning the body over to be buried, Jesus being wrapped in a heavy burial shroud and sealed in a tomb which would have killed him if he wasn't dead already, they say. Medical experts, modern medical experts, concluding that Jesus must have died on the cross based on the injuries he would have received from crucifixion. Non-Christian writers, Josephus, Tacitus, Julius Africanus, Thallus, Lucian, and Phlegon, referencing the death of Jesus, and early Christian writers like Polycarp, Ignatius, and Justin Martyr, affirming the death of Jesus during the crucifixion. Well, by my count, 9 of the 13 pieces of evidence are things that can be found only in the Bible. And one is the aforementioned bit about, well, crucifixion was so awful you were guaranteed to die. Another is the one about the opinion of medical experts is based entirely on the details of the crucifixion found or implied in the Bible. And the other two, the references of the later Christian and non-Christian writers, are essentially hearsay. The earliest of the non-Christian writers, Josephus, was either not yet born or a baby when Jesus died. And the same is true of the earliest of the Christian writers mentioned, Ignatius of Antioch. And the others weren't born until decades after what would have been the death of Jesus, if in fact that occurred. So, even if we take this proposed evidence at face value and ignore, say, the likelihood that the references to Jesus in the writings of Josephus were embellished by later Christians, what we're left with is a bunch of details from the Bible that are either meaningless, like prophecies about Jesus' death and resurrection, which in no way prove that the events they predict ever actually happened, or unsubstantiated and, despite the protests of apologists like Geisler and Saleeb, unreliable. There's nothing in the Bible or nothing external to the Bible that requires us to believe that Jesus lived, died, or was resurrected to make sense of history. I personally think that it's plausible that there was some form of a historical Jesus, but I don't think that the Gospels are a good source of information about what he said or did. I don't think he worked miracles. I don't think he was the Son of God. I don't think he was resurrected after his death. And I consider that the historical Jesus is really just a plausible option, not something that I feel compelled to believe in by the evidence. I usually say, yeah, there probably was a historical Jesus. It seems more likely than not that there was an actual figure who was the inspiration or the basis for these stories. But that's all I'm willing to say. And if someone comes up with a really good case, like for instance Richard Carrier, for why there wasn't a Jesus at all and it was completely invented, I think that there are some very compelling cases for that. I know of no evidence that cries out to me that says, oh, that says there must have been a Jesus. I've never heard that evidence. And this is what Geisler and Saleeb and pretty much every other Christian apologist I've ever read calls the best attested event in ancient history. The death of Jesus. An event for which there is no compelling evidence at all. Just predictions and perhaps some history mingled inextricably with legend recorded in a religious text, and some very general hearsay from writers writing outside of the Bible who lived after the time of the events. That's what we're talking about as the best attested event in ancient history. But just to be fair, let's consider the nature of ancient history. After all, history is not an exact science. We can reconstruct the past, but the further we go back into the past, the more dodgy that gets, and we can never be sure that we've gotten it exactly right, and we're less certain about some things than others. So, maybe the evidence, such as it is for the death of Jesus, is actually better than that for other ancient events. Unfortunately, for Geisler and Saleeb, that's not the case. I'm by no means a historian or even more than a somewhat informed layman, but I had no problem looking up ancient events while researching this video and finding quite a few that seem much more firmly established in the historical record than the death of Jesus. And to just cite one example, and it's an easy one, the assassination of Julius Caesar. It took place about 70 to 75 years before the death of Jesus, so slightly more ancient even. And we have an account of the assassination of Caesar, considered by historians to be reliable, written by someone who was alive at the time, who was not writing anonymously, who was in a position that would have allowed him to accurately know what happened. I'm talking about Nicholas of Damascus. And while many details of Caesar's assassination that we know today come from later accounts, the basics, that there was a conspiracy to assassinate Caesar, that Caesar was killed on the Ides of March, that he was stabbed to death by a group of the conspirators, are found in that account written by Nicholas, who included it in a biography of Emperor Augustus that was probably completed around the time of the death of Augustus in the year AD 14. Now that is 50 years after the assassination of Caesar, but it was written by a prolific and respected historian who was actually alive when the event took place. And the account of the assassination by Nicholas isn't just a passing reference to the fact that Caesar was killed, as most of the extra-biblical mentions of Jesus are. But the account of the assassination by Nicholas is fairly extensive. And we also have books that survive to this day that are almost universally considered to be authentic that were written by Caesar himself, which can't be counted as evidence for the circumstances of his death, of course, but can be counted as evidence that Caesar actually existed. He was a real person. We have far more reliable evidence that Julius Caesar actually existed than we have that Jesus actually existed. So it follows that well-attested events from the life of Caesar ought to be considered more firmly established than events from the life of Jesus, right? Because how can an event from the life of a person who almost certainly existed be less well established than a possible event from the life of a person who might or might not have ever lived? Now, of course, I want to acknowledge that Caesar was an extremely important figure during his lifetime. He was a military and political leader of great prominence and power. It makes sense that his existence and the important events of his life would be easier to substantiate today than events in the life of someone like Jesus, who seems to have left a minimal impact on the world in which he actually lived and didn't become well known until long after his death through the actions of his followers. But the point remains. The death of Julius Caesar, hell, any important event from the life of Julius Caesar for which we have good evidence, is a much better attested occurrence in ancient history than the death or certainly the resurrection of Jesus. It's not even close. We can say with a great deal of confidence that Julius Caesar was a real person, a successful military leader who eventually became dictator of Rome, and that he died as a result of a conspiracy to assassinate him on the 15th of March in the year 44 BC. We can't say the same about any event in the life of Jesus, including his death. Is there a solid date for anything in the life of Jesus? The day he was born? The day he was baptized by John the Baptist? The day he worked his first miracle? The day he was crucified? The day he rose from the dead? No. The closest I've ever heard is that he was probably born somewhere between the years 6 and 4 BC, and he was probably crucified sometime between the years 30 and 33 AD. Greater evidence for Jesus' death than almost any other event in ancient history? Please. That's a preposterous thing to say, and expecting me to take it seriously is an insult to my intelligence. Next, Geisler and Saleeb attempt to make the case for Jesus being the Son of God. They do this by launching into the usual apologist case for the authenticity of the Gospels. They discuss 4 lines of evidence for the authenticity of the Gospels, which are, and this will sound familiar to those of you who have been down this road before, the accurate transmission of the New Testament documents from the time of their origin to today, the reliability of the witnesses on which the New Testament is based or allegedly based, the fact that Jesus himself claimed to be the Son of God, and the miracles worked by Jesus. Now, this is well-worn ground, especially if you've watched some of my previous An Atheist Read series, so I'll cover the supposed accuracy of the New Testament quickly with an eye toward the Islamic focus of this book, and then I'll move on to something that I think is a bit more interesting. So, I find myself agreeing to an extent with the Muslim position on the New Testament, at least as it's been presented in this book. The New Testament which we have today, being largely unchanged from the original ancient documents, means nothing if I don't believe what is written in those documents is true in the first place. And I don't. And from what I understand, neither do most Muslims. Muslims believe that the New Testament is a corruption of the Quran, of an authentic revelation given by God to Jesus. Now, I believe there's no reason to believe there's any such thing as an authentic revelation from God, and that what history the New Testament does contain is highly embellished and corrupted with legend. But we both reach the same conclusion. A perfectly preserved, unreliable, untrue account is still an unreliable, untrue account. You can spend pages and pages, as Geisler and Saleeb do, trying to establish that the New Testament we have today is substantially the same as the New Testament they had 1,500, 2,000 years ago. It makes no difference to me if I don't believe what it says in the first place. A perfectly transmitted fraud is still a fraud. Now let's talk about the reliability of those New Testament witnesses. This is also a absolutely pulverized dead horse, but there's something about how Geisler and Saleeb go about beating it that caught my attention. On page 245, they go over David Hume's criteria for credibility, which they summarize like this, quote, "Do the witnesses contradict each other? Are there a sufficient number of witnesses? Were the witnesses truthful? Were they non-prejudicial?" Those are the criteria for credibility of a witness, paraphrased from David Hume by the authors. So, applying these 4 questions to the Gospels, Geisler and Saleeb, of course, conclude that the writers of the Gospels are exceedingly credible. They claim that while there are some minor discrepancies in the various Gospel accounts, there are no irreconcilable contradictions. And again, on this point, I recommend that you check out the Skeptics Annotated Bible and the Contradictions page. And there's both a big comprehensive list of contradictions from the entire Bible. You can also go into the individual books of the Bible on that website and select to just look at a list of the contradictions contained in each individual book. I highly recommend it. Here's just a sample from the book of Matthew. There are genealogies of Jesus through the line of his father Joseph, listed in the books of Matthew and also in the book of Luke. Those two genealogies do not match up anywhere close to each other. The genealogies list different numbers of generations. Matthew lists 28 generations from David to Jesus, and Luke lists 43 generations from David to Jesus. And those two genealogies only have 3 names in common, other than David at the one end and Jesus at the other. So you have 2 completely irreconcilable genealogies from David to Jesus, where they almost have completely different names of the descendants and the relatives. But no irreconcilable contradictions, according to Geisler and Saleeb. Geisler and Saleeb also claim that the writers of the gospel were truthful because they say that they were being truthful, and they actually quote lines from the Bible where Peter and where other authors of the Gospels or in the New Testament say, hey, we're telling the truth here. We're not just making this up. So obviously we have to believe them because they told us that they're telling the truth, right? Seems legit. Sure, they describe the occurrence of impossible things, but they say they're telling the truth, so I guess the most reasonable thing for us to do is to believe those impossible things actually happened, right? I mean, they said they were telling the truth. What more do you want? But the really interesting bit is that last question in the Hume criteria. Were the witnesses non-prejudicial? Geisler and Saleeb don't address that question directly. They just sort of fold it into their overall defense of the truthfulness of the gospel authors. Whoever they were, by the way, it bears repeating that the gospels are anonymously authored despite being traditionally attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But keeping that criterion of being non-prejudicial in mind, let's go back a few pages and see how Geisler and Saleeb describe the authors of the Gospels themselves. Quote, Matthew is written by a disciple. Mark was a disciple of Peter. Luke was an educated contemporary of Christ. John the Apostle was a direct eyewitness. By Geisler and Saleeb's description, 3 of the 4 gospel writers were either disciples of Jesus himself or disciples of one of the original 12 apostles. And though they don't mention it in their writing, for some reason, church tradition holds that Luke, in addition to being an educated contemporary of Jesus, was a disciple of Paul. So if we accept the traditional authors of the Gospels as authentic, all 4 Gospels were written by people who devoted their lives to Jesus, who believed that he was the Son of God, but we're supposed to regard their testimony as non-prejudicial because, what, they swore they weren't making any of it up? They swore that they weren't biased? I'm sorry, but that just doesn't hold water, especially given the incredible nature of much of that testimony. Angels, devils, miracles, resurrections, etc. And that they would make these tired old arguments, I'm talking about Geisler and Saleeb now, in a book ostensibly intended to prepare their readers to witness to Muslims, is perhaps the best evidence I've seen yet that these guys just have nothing else to say. Whether the audience is Christians or atheists or Muslims or whoever, the case is always the same because they have nothing else. Why a devout Muslim would find Geisler and Saleeb's arguments for the truth of Christianity and therefore also the falsity of Islam persuasive, I have no idea. The persuasive power of that case is not increased by how condescending Geisler and Saleeb often are. For example, toward the end of this chapter, when they return to the previously mentioned notion that Muslims have simply misunderstood some of the concepts of Christianity, they say, quote, Indeed, many Muslims grossly conceive of Jesus as the offspring of sexual relations between God and the Virgin Mary. This, of course, is a straw man and is easily refuted by reference to what the Bible actually says about the miraculous conception of Jesus without any sexual relations. Yes, it's just that Muslims don't understand the concept of Jesus as the Son of God. They think it means that Jesus was the offspring of Mary and God, which, and here's the important thing, he unavoidably was. I don't see how you get around that. Whether God miraculously caused Mary to be with child or laid her down in the hay and made sweet, sweet love to her, the fact remains that Jesus had a mother who was Mary and a father who was God. Sex or no sex. Actually, forget no sex. There was definitely sex involved. Not necessarily sexual relations as we conventionally think of them, but sexual reproduction. For fuck's sake, Jesus didn't just appear on earth out of nowhere. Mary was pregnant with him and gave birth to him. That's sexual reproduction, partner. And I know I went over this point before in a previous video in this series, but it bears repeating because Geisler and Saleeb come back to it to argue that one reason Muslims reject Christianity is that they just don't get it. And maybe for some Muslims that's true. I'm sure there are some Muslims who just don't understand what Christians are going on about when they talk about Jesus being the Son of God and a person of the Trinity and all of that. But what Geisler and Saleeb don't realize, or realize but don't want to admit, is that a Muslim or a follower of any religion or no religion can get it and still reject it. You can have an understanding of Christian doctrine every bit as sound as that of Norman Geisler and still conclude that it's bullshit, that your religion is better, or that your belief that all religions are false is still valid. And the insistence that Muslims don't understand the concept of Jesus as the Son of God is rendered even sillier by the fact that Geisler and Saleeb don't even seem to fully understand it themselves. If they did understand it, they would admit that according to their own doctrines, in addition to Christ being a co-equal person of the eternal Holy Trinity, Jesus was necessarily the physical, biological Son of Mary and God. Anyway, this chapter goes on for a bit from here, rehashing the usual arguments for the resurrection and so forth. But enough of that. I just mentioned the Trinity again. So let's move on to chapter 12, a defense of the Trinity. And how do our authors begin this chapter in their effort to educate their fellow Christians on how to reach out to Muslims and win them for Christ? By addressing Muslim misunderstandings of the Trinity. Quote, "Perhaps no concept in all of Christian terminology receives such a violent reaction from Muslims as Jesus is the only begotten Son of God. This raises red flags immediately in the Islamic mind. Indeed, as we shall see, they understand it in a grossly anthropomorphic manner." And then they go over the whole Christ wasn't actually an offspring of God, he's an eternal and equal part of the Trinity bit, again, only in even more laborious detail than before. See, the Bible refers to Jesus as the only begotten Son of God, but that phrase could also be translated, and sometimes is translated, more like the one and only Son of God. It implies a special relationship between Christ and God the Father. Not that Christ was generated by God, like a child. See, here's what Geisler and Saleeb think the problem is. Muslims believe that God has no ancestors and no descendants. Muslims believe God is whole and unified and eternal. So when a Muslim hears someone say that God has a son, they call bullshit because they think that Christ is God's physical, biological son, when actually Christ is a person of the Trinity who is called the Son for some fucking unfathomable reason that has nothing to do with him actually being a son, that is, a child of God. Anyway, here's what the problem actually is. Muslims believe that God has no ancestors or descendants, is whole and unified and eternal, and the Bible says that God miraculously impregnated Mary and then she had a baby. It doesn't matter if that baby is the human incarnation of an eternal, uncreated person of the Holy Trinity, and in that sense is not actually an offspring of God. The problem is that God and a lady made a baby. That's what Muslims have a problem with. Talk your throat sore about Christ and how he's eternal and how son doesn't mean son. I'll give you all of that. Whatever you say, Jesus, the baby, the man, the product of Mary and God, by whatever specific process he was made, is literally an offspring of God. He was created by God through human reproduction, at least in part. I don't see how Geisler and Saleeb could possibly deny this. And that is what Muslims have a problem with. It's not that they don't understand what Christians mean when they say Jesus was the Son of God. Maybe some of them don't, but the point is you can understand the concept and still object to it if you hold to the Islamic belief that God is absolutely unified and neither begets nor is begotten. Anyway, that's just to do with Christ. What about the concept of the Trinity overall? Quote, both Islam and Christianity proclaim that God is one in essence. What is in dispute is whether there can be any plurality of persons in this unity of nature. The inadequacies in the Muslim view of God arise in part out of their misunderstanding of Christian monotheism. Just a misunderstanding. These Muslims, they just don't get it, see? I find myself in an unusual position here because as an atheist, I find Islam to be no more or less false than Christianity, and I would not be at all surprised to find that Islamic apologists can be just as condescending toward Christians as Geisler and Saleeb are toward Muslims in this book, offering patronizing explanations of the bits of doctrine they must have simply misunderstood. So I'm sort of taking the Islamic side of things here, but only because I know that it is too easy for Geisler and Saleeb to simply chalk up the disagreements, the differences between Christianity and Islam to a misunderstanding on the part of Muslims. It's not a misunderstanding. It's that you believe different shit. And neither of you have any evidence to show who, if anyone, is actually correct. Muslims don't believe that Christ as the Son of God and that Christ is the Son of God and that the Trinity is the existence of three co-equal persons of a single God are bullshit concepts because they misunderstand them. Most Muslims who have studied the subject probably understand them just fine. It's just that they believe different shit. They believe that God is singular. There is no God but God. And that one God is absolutely unified. One being, one essence, one person, not three persons sharing one essence and one being. Muslims think that's bullshit and that it doesn't make any sense. And on this point, I agree with them. The Trinity is bullshit and it doesn't make any sense. It's a complicated and absurd concept that early Christians invented in order to reconcile their beliefs that God was up in heaven being God while Jesus was on earth walking around and telling people he was God. It's arguably become the defining doctrine of Christianity over the last 1900 years or so, but it started out as a patch, as a bit of spackle to smooth over some uneven areas. Think about it. If God is a Trinity, and always has been, and that's important for us to know, why isn't it specified anywhere in the Bible? There's not a single passage anywhere in the Old or the New Testament where God or one of his prophets says, hey, here's the deal. God is a Trinitarian being. There's one God, but there are three persons of this one God, and they're all equal, and they've all existed since forever, and they're all God. Trinitarian Christians will tell you that the doctrine of the Trinity is implied throughout the Bible, but it seems like God isn't so subtle about the important stuff any other time. The authority of God isn't implied. The power of God isn't implied. The jealousy of God isn't implied. The God of the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, is blunt and intrusive and extremely heavy-handed and picky and not at all shy about telling people how to dress, how to cut their hair, what to eat, how to arrange their society. And according to Christians, God was triune in the Old Testament, just the same as in the New, but not a word about it. Early Christians invented the Trinity to reconcile God being God and Jesus being God at the same time. Muslims reconciled that another way. They said, okay, I guess Jesus wasn't God then. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a different belief. Here's a perfect example of how pointless and asinine these theological disagreements are, because now they bust out some math on my ass. Quote, Muslim scholars make a big point of computing the mathematical impossibility of the Trinity. After all, does not 1 plus 1 plus 1 equal 3? It certainly does if you add them. Well, that would be implied by the plus, guys. Anyway, but Christians insist that this is the wrong way to understand the Trinity. The Trinity of God is more like 1 times 1 times 1 equals 1. In other words, we multiply, not add the one God in three persons. That is, God is triune, not triplex. His one essence has multiple personalities. Aha! He does have dissociative identity disorder. I knew it! See, it's not 1 plus 1 plus 1. It's 1 times 1 times 1. And God is like an egg. He's got a shell, a white, and a yolk, but he's still just one egg. Oh, and you know what else? God is like water, because he's steam, he's liquid, and he's ice, but he's always water. Oh no, you know what he is? He's like bread, because he's raw bread dough, but he's also a baked loaf of bread. But then, when that loaf of bread goes stale, you can turn God into croutons. Do you believe in the Trinity yet? Even a little bit? Be honest. Geisler and Saleeb spend the rest of the chapter defending the concept of the Trinity and covering much of this ground over and over again. God is the what, while the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are the who. I like my crouton thing better, personally, but whatever. They do manage to land one punch against Islamic thought, though, and it's on the second to last page of the chapter, and it's this, quote, Orthodox Muslims believe the Quran is eternal and uncreated, yet it is not the same as God, but is an expression of God's mind, as imperishable as God himself. Surely there is a plurality within unity, something that is other than God, but is nonetheless one with God. Touché, Geisler and Saleeb. Good point. Isn't it inconsistent with the notion of the absolute oneness and uniqueness of God to believe that the Quran, like God, is eternal and uncreated? Seems like a contradiction to me, though I doubt a well-studied Islamic apologist would have much trouble wriggling out of that particular hole. They'd probably say something like, well, the Quran is God's speech, and God's speech is an eternal attribute of God. It's not different from God, it's just a part of him. But nonetheless, I do think that's a good point on the part of Geisler and Saleeb. Now, one last quote, and it's a short one. Quote, at the heart of the difference between Islam and Christianity stands the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. Muslims protest that it is neither biblical nor intelligible. And they're right. At least on one point. Christians can interpret the Bible to make pretty much anything biblical, so that might not be a fair point, but it's definitely not intelligible. Even if I were compelled to believe in the existence of God, I can think of no reason why I should believe in something as weird and awkward and counterintuitive as one God with three personalities. Of course, I can't think of any reason to believe in any sort of God, no matter how elegant or convoluted its conception might be. Well, that is it for chapters 11 and 12. I will be back in the next video in the series to finish the book. The next video in the series will be the last video in this series. I will cover chapter 13, which is titled A Defense of Salvation by the Cross, and there's also some closing material, some endnotes, and appendices and such. I'll cover anything that seems interesting or relevant in there. And then that's it. We're done with the critique of answering Islam. I want to thank you guys as always, for watching. Please, if you enjoyed this video, like it and share it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel if you're not subbed already. And also, I want to remind you, as always, to please consider becoming a supporter of this channel through Patreon. You can help me through your contribution of any amount that you're comfortable with on a monthly basis to make more videos like this one and like the other videos I make on this channel. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron. The next milestone in the Patreon campaign, which I am creeping up on every day, is audio-only podcasts of the An Atheist Read series. Brand new, fresh, high-quality audio recordings to listen to as you're in the car or exercising or at work or whatever. Audio-only versions of the An Atheist Read series. Fresh, new, high-quality recordings. One of the most requested projects I have ever gotten. And when I get to the next milestone in my Patreon campaign, I will begin to produce and release those. All of the An Atheist Read series, going all the way back to the Case for Christ and through all of the ones I have done, and then ongoing as I continue to make new ones. So please consider becoming a Patreon supporter if this is something that you enjoy and if you can afford it and you think I'm worth it. Thanks again for watching, everybody. I look forward to reading your comments. Let me know what I got right, what I got wrong. Agree, disagree, be you Christian, Muslim, atheist, whatever. And I will see you in the next video to wrap this one up.